Hello everyone. My name is Shane Coughlin and I'm the General Manager of the OpenChain project at the Linux Foundation. Today what I'd like to do is to focus on the big picture of how we manage things like software bill of materials. Because we're a small crowd, I don't want to have a simple static approach to this. I'd like to make sure that we have some space to be interactive. So what I'd like to do is to explain some of the big picture and then create the environment where we can do Q&A and back and forth. So when it comes to starting with the big picture, I'm going to start talking about something called the OpenChain project, and that's what I run at the Linux Foundation. The OpenChain project makes standards for open source licensing and security. Now, the purpose of the project is to make sure that we have an environment that allows companies to have the right processes in place for good supply chain management. The reasons for this are simple, and of course I'll give you some data points for the sake of context, but you know the basics here. The supply chain has many problems. Recently, for instance, about 18 months ago with the White House executive order on addressing things like software bill of materials, those concepts have come to the front of people's thinking. However, we have actually been working on this stuff for a very long time. The OpenChain project, by way of example, has been in market with standards for process management since 2016. If we want to pick a particular software bill of materials as an illustration of market thinking, something like SPDX has been in market for 12 years. So the industry has been working on these thorny problems for a while, and the obvious reason is that the supply chain isn't like this. It's a giant spaghetti monster of chaos. The data points on the supply chain, there's plenty of them, indicate we have some serious issues. With over 65% of managers monitoring their supply chain in Excel, you can see that having systemic approaches like software bill of materials is pretty rare. Now, interestingly, data indicates that over 90% of companies don't actually have full visibility into their supply chain, which is a polite way of saying regardless of software bill of materials, companies have supply chains, stuff comes out of the supply chains, but no one really knows how. Now, open source naturally is not exempt from this type of management challenge. Most industries are now indicating 100% of code bases contain some open source. In the industry verticals that Synopsys found the least use of open source, they were still seeing 93% or above. Now, that is an interesting set of data points because over half of code bases have license compliance issues and over 80% of them have security vulnerabilities in play. That's obviously concerning. It's not just open source naturally that's impacted by things like this. We're talking about an open source is software challenge. All software has issues around things like compliance and security. But our optic today is really coming at the how do we look at this stuff from the open source perspective. So when it comes to managing the supply chain with something like open source, we have some good data points about the fact that companies know we should be doing better, and they have known for a while. We know that supply chain optimization offers up to 40% savings on management costs for that supply chain. Over half of companies think that supply chain management is a competitive edge, and 70% think it impacts customer service. Yet we're not seeing the results we'd want overarchingly in supply chains. From the optic I come at, where I'm coming at this is the fact that open source license compliance and security assurance is a key part of supply chain management. Now, SBOMs are obviously critical to this, and we need to have them. But before we can get to SBOMs, we need to have a strong process foundation. An SBOM ultimately is an implementation choice for record keeping and record sharing. Overarching processes are needed that you apply SBOMs to. So a bunch of companies were thinking about that type of challenge back in 2015 and came to market in 2016 as the OpenChain project. You can see the current 25 board members on this slide. These companies were asking the question, if we are concerned about things like license compliance and over time increasingly security, what type of framework approach do we need to address managing the software? What type of process approach do we need? Now, obviously, software bill of materials was always going to be at the core of that. But all alone, that's not sufficient. The question was, what do we do as a big picture approach? We've been very lucky over time that more and more companies have not just said, having a systemic big picture approach is a good idea, but they've stepped up to help lead things. The most recent company to join our board is Volkswagen, with Cariad, their software arm. This type of company is at the forefront of managing thousands of moving parts in terms of corporate suppliers. And they are the type of company that can really talk about the complexity of SBOM management. Now, our members represent almost $6 trillion in market value, so they have some weight. I mean, as they were noodling on this problem, they realized that even with all of the weight they have, they're not big enough to move the market, either for SBOMs or bigger questions. So the OpenChain project was born not just to create some standards or to instruct the market about good ideas of how to do things, but to actually build a global community of companies collaborating. And now we have a substantial global community with special interest groups on certain industry verticals, regional and local work groups operating in their respective languages, and all types of interesting things happening apart from standards. The type of verticals that are impacted by what we're doing on process management and setting the tone for SBOM are diverse. This slide just shows some of the companies that are A, on our board, or B, came to us and said, hey, please add our logo to your website. This is just a sampling, but I thought it was interesting to show you the type of cross-vertical impact that we get when we ask people, how do we do this in a systemic, repeatable way? And of course, there are so many more companies in our community noodling on this. This slide is a hodgepodge of just some of the companies on 3 of our mailing lists. Lockheed Martin is front and center because they're currently co-chairing our standards development. It's over 1,000 companies in the OpenChain project working on these challenges. And the question then is, what are they specifically working on? And this is where I finally get to the point about the high-level process management. So the OpenChain project is building process management standards. The first one came to market in 2016 as a de facto standard. It became an ISO standard in 2020. That's for open source license compliance. And one of the central tenets of this is, of course, to have an SBOM. Likewise, we're in market now with a security standard. It's a de facto standard right now, and it's incoming as an ISO standard as well. I just got a positive email about the completion of our ISO ballot, and I should have the precise timing of publication shortly. Again, SBOM at the center, but not just SBOM. When it comes to actually managing the supply chain, or just an individual company, we need far more than an SBOM. Remember, I said it's an implementation choice. There are multiple implementation choices to be made. We have a requirement for inbound processes, internal training policy and processes, and outbound processes. To help frame this, the OpenChain project decided to take an approach of saying, have a way to identify inbound software, have a way to track what's going on inside your company and make sure that people are trained, the appropriate people are applied to implementing policy, have a way to check outbound. SBOM is obviously key to that, but we're not prescriptive about what your training should be, what your policy should be, or what your SBOM should be. The fact is, touching on multiple industry verticals suggests that The concept of an SBOM will be critical. The specific choice of an SBOM will depend on the company and the market and the particular moment in time. So we wanted to make the kind of overarching framework standards top of the pyramid, you could say. And then as you go down the pyramid, you're making choices like, okay, so I need an SBOM. What specific SBOM is most suitable for my use case? Then as you go further down that pyramid of complexity, you start thinking, right, I have the overarching process, I have an SBOM choice, how do I automate this? And so on. So in a sense then what I'm saying is we need to start at the beginning, at the top, and work our way down. Now in the case of our particular standards, we are making ISO standards. We're supporting the adoption through three different things: self-certification, independent assessment, and third-party certification. Depending on your market needs, you will make different choices. In some markets, third-party certification is obviously very important. In others, self-assessment is more than sufficient. When it comes to something like self-certification, we like to make sure that checklists and so on are available. On our website, openchainproject.org, we have online checklists. We have downloadable checklists. We keep our core editing version of the checklists on GitHub. Anyway, giving you some specifics of the type of things that are happening. What type of impact do you have when you take a large bird's eye view on the market space? You're encouraging the adoption of SBOM, but you're coming at it from the high-level process management approach. We've had 100 companies come to us and ask to be listed on our website as OpenChain conformant for the license compliance standard. But we know there's a lot more companies. PwC did a survey in 2021 and they found 20% of companies in Germany with over 2,000 employees were reporting they already used our ISO standard for open source license compliance. Now, all kind of caveats apply. That's the companies in the sample surveyed by PwC. But it's an indicator that what we have on our website is a multiple industry sample of the type of organizations picking up these standards. Recently, we've seen fantastic traction in places like China with Alibaba Cloud, ByteDance, China Mobile, SAIC, and Xfusion announcing OpenChain conformance. SAIC, by the way, is Shanghai Automotive, and Z1 is their software development unit. And we're very glad to have China's biggest automaker begin to put our standards into play. Now, as I said, those numbers are examples. There's a lot of market adoption out there, and the OpenChain project making ISO standards really only gets the details when people come to us. And naturally, we can't go around the world asking companies, what's in your commercial contracts? So if you are using our standards already, please do let me know. I would love to have that data point. On the security side, quite frankly, it's a more recent concern in the market space. There's all this momentum behind security, SBOMs for security, management of software for security. We were in market on license compliance first. More recently, security trended, and people started using our license compliance standard to identify key points that are also useful for security. That's when we created the sister standard for security, and we've seen some great progress on it. As I said, we are in a positive phase of finalizing our ISO ballot, so we're moving from de facto security process standard into ISO security process standard, and we're already seeing adoption of the de facto standard. Most recently, LG announced their adoption of it for managing their open source security processes on certain product lines. Okay, there's a ton of other stuff happening across a project like this, so I'm not going to go into detail. There's just like loads of reference material. There's a ton of meetings and events. We have probably the world's largest reference library for things about open source process management, whether it's about things like how do I make a policy, through to decisions like how do I begin thinking about SBOM. We try to collate material on that. We've got specific materials on various flowcharts, samples, all of these things. And some of our material is going into interesting production cycles with companies like Continental, Bosch, and KPMG using our online training material for their internal engineer education. We do a ton of webinars. So this speech I'm giving is a great example of being kindly invited, but we have done an absolute ton of webinars under our own banner as well to try to give people deeper dives. I'm flagging this because we have specific and long webinars on SBOM material like SPDX 3.0, which is just coming to market now. And that's about an hour long, so it's a deep dive. And we're at a ton of events, naturally. Most recently, I did Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen in China. Ton of events and great crowd. Now, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here just to flag that when it comes to something like open source and software bill of materials, the approach is very collaborative, and something like the OpenChain project, building the overarching process standards, is actually developing the standards on calls which are open to everyone via GitHub in a manner where everyone can open issues, and on a mailing list that again is open to everyone. While we have an ISO standard for license compliance in market, and we're just about to launch our ISO standard for security via ISO, it's already out as a de facto standard, we're already building the next generations of these standards, and we're doing it in the public. I'm highlighting this because other projects, like specifically SPDX making their SBOM variant, also develop in the open. And it's a very, I think, useful method for the industry to get practical, industry relevant, very industry relevant outcomes in a manner that's entirely democratic. You don't have to pay money to join the meetings. You don't have to pay money to influence the editing process. The gatekeepers, so to say, at the very end are our governing board who review all the suggestions from around the world and decide go or no go. But until we reach the necessary moment for someone to decide go or no go on the next generation of a standard, there's all of that time for people to create suggestions, edits, justifications, and so on. And when it comes to areas like the legal domain, which is not just a hot topic for overarching standards such as OpenChain, but also specific SBOM questions, we've tried to help fill a market need there as well with a legal work group launching in Q2. And basically they're exploring the type of provisions which can be useful when talking about open source and procurement. It's the type of language that lawyers can use when they're trying to think, how do I ask my supplier to maybe use one of these standards? How can I think about the language for using an SBOM? So we've picked up a 15-year-old document which was co-created by myself and others a long time ago when open source was more of a baby. And we're now looking at it with fresh eyes and creating model provisions for things like the OpenChain standards and things like SBOM. Right, to wrap up before Q&A, I just wanted to highlight that this type of activity is user companies doing stuff to solve their problems. But there's a huge amount of support from various types of provider. So for instance, the OpenChain project alone has 12 official third-party certifiers around the world. Today we just announced Deloitte. We have 28 service providers around the world. We've got 22 legal providers and 12 tooling vendors around the world. Now these are official partners. These are companies that are working closely with us. So, you know, these third-party certifiers have teams that engage with the OpenChain project, know us very well, and contribute to the development of not just their product portfolio, but our community. Two examples here. For example, we have CAICT in China doing a lot of work to help us with conferences. We've got PwC doing a lot of work in Germany to help with events. Right. The TLDR, the ending up point, is if you're not already aware of the OpenChain project, please take a moment to have a look at us. We are in a situation where the supply chain is inefficient, and we have a lot of work to do to improve it. The fundamental concepts of having some key processes in play have been mapped out to the extent where they are ISO standards. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Software bill of materials has, long before the current trend, been a central tenet of this. To be frank with you, your specific choice of software bill of materials is less important than the fact you have one, so that record keeping can begin to align in the supply chain. Ideally, in a perfect world, where we shall never live, everyone would use the same perfect software bill of materials. In the real world, where people will have different opinions and different demands, we will have a variety of software bill of materials in play. But if everyone has a software bill of materials, if that's part of their key process management, we dramatically reduce errors in the supply chain. OpenChain tries to put that tenet in place. It says, check what your software is, train people, have a policy, check what it is before you go to market. And in doing that management, have a software bill of materials. So we set the high-level framework. Right now in market, you've got multiple choices for software bill of materials. NTIA talked about SPDX, CycloneDX, and SWID. Those are not the only software bill of materials in the market. In the OpenChain community, SPDX is probably the most popular. CycloneDX, of course, has quite a few adherents, and we also have interesting forks. There is a variant of SPDX used by Toyota called SPDX plus T. Siemens in Germany have taken CycloneDX and forked it and made Siemens S-Bomb. People are doing their thing. The important thing is we do have a software bill of materials in play, and from there at least we can normally gather key information and go to market in a better way. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there and see if there's any questions you may have, because what we've got there is an overview of what's interesting about the market, but we don't have a recommendation. I'm not saying what software bill of materials to use, and I'm leaving the floor open for you to ask questions about the parameters of software bill of materials, or interest or concerns about processes you've seen regarding software bill of materials. So I just want to pause there and see if anyone has any questions.
Yes, thanks for sharing. Yes, so that's a very interesting topic for us. Maybe for some of us it's a new topic. So I just posted this, see if from audience there are any questions to share.
Of course. And while people are considering, I'll just tell you a very brief story. SPDX, I mentioned, is about 12 years old, but about 14 or 15 years ago, two people from Motorola, so Esteban Rocket and John Ellis, came up with the first concept that I've encountered of software bill of materials for open source being mentioned. And when they first brought it up in legal meetings around that time, it was too early, and people didn't really get why we'd want to have a bill of materials for software in the same way as we do for hardware. So, even if someone is brand new to this concept, just be aware that it's not long ago since everyone was brand new to this concept, and that's one reason I advocate from starting at the very highest level of process management and working our way down, as opposed to, jumping in at the S-bomb point rather than having the overarching approach first.
Okay, sure. So do you have some examples, for instance, how to apply this to ORAN concept? Since ORAN also we have this open source approach, right, for some components implementations, and also what involving multi-vendors for these different ROM parts to integrate together. Is this some place that this SBOM can be applied?
Yes.
Because it really takes some time to understand this concept, as we deal with the telecom engineer.
Of course.
When it deals with our own implementations.
Yes, it's a wonderful question. And I think the simplest answer is yes, of course. And, yes, so absolutely, yes, of course. However, decisions around a complex market like telco are nuanced, and for that reason, I'm quite glad to report that the thinking is being done in markets like telco right now. So the OpenChain project has a telco workgroup, and the telco workgroup is specifically working on material to help with thinking about SBOM in telco. And I think that might be useful. I'm just putting a link here to their GitHub repository, and specifically I'm going to put a link to their SBOM specification. Specifically, they're trying to think about, in an industry like telco, in an industry like networking, if that industry is thinking about SBOM, how can it think about it? Okay, so one way we can get started with something like SBOM is go and download a standard and see if it makes sense. And it will rarely make sense because we're not prepped for the context. So I think that the work by the telco work group here may to some extent be useful for you. Pulling in the screen share, and I don't expect you to read this is just an example. They're doing this description of what SBOMs are, and they're saying how SBOMs work and options and blah blah blah. So they're setting the tone for how your type of domain can begin to think about SBOMs. So I think that's where you should start. But if you want a real nutshell, a software bill of materials ultimately is thinking about what's the minimum work we can do to have the key tags so that we know that X piece of software has either B, some problems, or C, some requirements. And you can start very simple. Just think of it as a way to tag the software for the key data points you need. And you don't need to implement a complex software bill of materials or approach. There are actions such as there's something called SPDX Lite. I'll just type the name into this field. SPDX Lite was created by the OpenChain Japan workgroup. And looking at something like SPDX, thinking, gosh, the whole standard can be overwhelming, but key tags, software name, originating, location, version, license, etc. A handful of key tags could be very useful cross-industry, contained in Excel spreadsheets, if that's what the managers must do, and allow us to track, archive, and then audit what's going on in a better way. I hope that makes sense, trying to explain the model in play here.
So this is some kind of rules or to follow that software.
Right.
So is anything had to be implemented also in the software or the source code, or just to say this software open source is follow this OpenChain standard, then can be shared with some other information can be shared.
Absolutely. So let me show you what type of accompanying data might be useful. Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to do now with OpenChain specifically, it's a process management thing. So you're not going to be doing something with your software for OpenChain. Your software happens to be passing through a program that's OpenChain conformant. Okay, so it's a slightly different question. But if you want to have the software tagged, if you want to add a software bill of materials, then you essentially have a series of simple tags, but consistent tags that allow you to understand what's going on with the project, what's going on with the software. So let me just copy paste a couple from what's called the SPDX software bill of materials. Okay, so I'm just going to copy paste a tiny snippet into our chat, and this would accompany your software. As a file adjacent to it. And this file would contain data saying something like, SPDX snippet begin, SPDX license identifier, that tells you what license the software is. SPDX snippet copyright text, that gives you the key copyright text which you have to have, and SPDX snippet name, so that's just saying what this fragment of software is from. And these consistent tags allow us to track the software snippets or the software components or the software packages. This allows us, when we dig it up after 10 years, to have a consistent way to quickly read what is this, what terms apply, who did it belong to. And that can be quite important because obviously at any scale, we don't want humans to necessarily be involved. So if you can point an automated scanning tool, and there's plenty available for free as well as commercial, if you can point one of them at, let's say, your archive, because it's a consistent SBOM, it takes the data automatically and orders it for you and just says this applies. So you could regard it in this way. Something like OpenChain is saying, in my company, we will have a process for checking inbound software and recording what it is. As it happens, that process is an SBOM. We choose SBOM type SPDX, and therefore we're going to implement certain tags, like the tags I copy-pasted here, to tag the software. And then you go one level down and you say, okay, so we're going to implement tags on the software. So we'll want to try and have the implementation automated, and we'll want to try and have the recovery of archiving automated. So we'll also use a tool, and we choose tool ABC to do this. So it's a sequence of decisions: process, SBOM choice, automation. Once you get it right, it means that your software is now eminently trackable, eminently auditable, no matter when you go back to it. So that's really the key here when we think about software bill of materials.
So okay, these tags are just safe contained, so don't need any place of centralized database to manage it.
Absolutely. So you're quite right. You don't need to have centralized databases or things like that. It's optional that, of course, a company might decide to have various databases, but fundamentally it's an implementation choice. And your choice of approach is not tied to your implementation choice. So you can decide to have a software bill of materials, like I mentioned SPDX Lite. This is SPDX Lite fields. So these are the fields. They have names like this. And you can implement these fields in a database that your company maintains. You can implement it in some Excel spreadsheets that track things. Whatever. It simply doesn't really matter what your implementation choice is, as long as you're using a coherent standardized SBOM, so that you or someone else in the future can come along and think, well, I want to know the version or type of SBOM that's used. I want to know what the licenses are. I want to know what the package versions are. And they have a reasonable expectation that the SBOM choice and the processes to manage the implementation will allow them to recover this information at any point in the future. So, yeah, we're talking about not being prescriptive. We're talking about having flexibility for different markets to do different things, but having overarching approaches, and I just put the link to SPDX Lite in this chat, overarching approaches that allow us to come back in the future and work out what just happened, why did it happen, what is this software? If we don't do that, the risk is that apart from this moment in time, when we're pretty confident of what it is, we'll forget, people will leave our company, etc., which has been consistently one of the biggest problems in the supply chain, especially when we might have 20, 30, 40 companies go to market for one product, and by the time you're in market, let's say as an endpoint telco, let's say NTT Docomo, or in China, China Mobile, by the time you get to market, it's possible that some of your suppliers are a couple of years after finishing their product. So ideally, you'd want them to have consistent, repeatable, standardized processes, standardized SBOMs, and record keeping, so that if it was necessary, you can go back and double check the software. If there's a security issue, you can quickly understand it and flag to them this needs fixing. It's all about reducing the amount of time we spend and the amount of resources we spend trying to manage this stuff.
Yeah, since it's quite useful for open source community, and since Aura has this community, maybe it has also good use for it. Good. So this may take some time to think about this, and maybe some questions come back to you since you already have your contact information. And also you share very good material to be studied and